The sirens wailed over Hearne, Texas, piercing the humid summer air as another convoy of German prisoners arrived at Camp Hearne. Private Paul Tennyson lowered his rifle, squinting against the afternoon sun as the dust-covered trucks rumbled through the gates. The war felt distant here, 3,000 miles from the European front, but Paul knew better. He'd seen enough of it firsthand before a piece of shrapnel in his leg had earned him this reassignment, guarding the enemy on American soil. "Eyes sharp, Tennyson," Captain Miller barked, pacing the fence line. "These men might look defeated, but they're still Nazis." Paul nodded, tightening his grip on his rifle. That's how he'd survived the fighting in Italy, by remembering that compassion got men killed. The Germans were the enemy. Period. You didn't see them as men with families, with dreams. You couldn't afford to. His brother James hadn't, and now he was buried somewhere in France. The prisoners descended from the trucks, their tan uniforms dirty and wrinkled from the journey. Most looked younger than Paul had expected, their expressions vacant or defiant. As he watched them shuffle into formation, he repeated the mantra that had kept him alive overseas: "They're not like us. They can't be." Inside the barracks that evening, Paul methodically checked his assigned section, clipboard in hand. The regulations were clear: minimal interaction, no fraternization. The prisoners were to be treated according to Geneva Convention standards, but with professional detachment. "Mail call tomorrow," Sergeant Weber announced as Paul completed his rounds. "Intelligence wants everything checked twice. The Krauts could be coding messages home about our defenses." Paul nodded. Another task, another day of guarding men he refused to see as human. It was safer that way. The war would end eventually, and he would go back to his life in Amarillo, to the family farm minus one brother. Until then, duty was all that mattered. The following afternoon, Paul sat at a small desk in the camp's administrative building, a stack of letters before him. Most were written in cramped German script he couldn't decipher, but it was his job to check for suspicious markings, codes, or anything that might compromise security. "These go to prisoner 4872, said Grace Keller, sliding another batch across the desk. The blonde WAC lieutenant had been assigned to help with translations. Her father had immigrated from Switzerland before she was born, giving her enough German to be useful to Army intelligence. "More love letters?" Paul asked dryly. "Actually, yes." Grace opened one envelope and skimmed its contents. "His wife writes to him every week. She's expecting their first child next month." Paul stiffened. "I don't need to know that." Grace looked up, her blue eyes challenging. "Does it make you uncomfortable, Private Tennyson? Realizing the enemy has families too. With all due respect, Lieutenant, they're still the enemy. My brother died making sure of that." He reached for the next envelope, determined to focus on the task, not the contents. "I'm sorry about your brother," she said quietly. "But these men are prisoners, not monsters. Most were conscripted. They didn't choose, they had choices." Paul cut her off. "We all do." Grace fell silent, but her words lingered uncomfortably as Paul continued his work. 3 days later, a transport of new prisoners arrived. Paul stood at attention near the processing station, watching as each man was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned quarters. One prisoner caught his attention, a tall man with a professor's wire-rimmed glasses who spoke excellent English. "Prisoner 5116, the processing sergeant called out. "Friedrich Werner." "I prefer Fritz," the prisoner said calmly, adjusting his glasses. "Nobody cares what you prefer," the sergeant snapped. As the prisoner was led away, Paul noticed him stumble slightly. The man grimaced, his hand going to his side. Later that evening, during his rounds, Paul found the same prisoner sitting on his bunk, reading a worn book of poetry. The barracks were quiet, most of the men were in the mess hall. "You're injured," Paul said, surprising himself by speaking. Fritz looked up. "It's nothing serious." Old wound from Russia. Paul should have walked away. Instead, he found himself asking, "How'd you end up there?" "I was a university lecturer, German literature." Fritz's eyes were resigned behind his glasses. "When the conscription notice came, I had a choice, serve or be shot as a deserter. I chose to live." Paul shifted uncomfortably. "You should have the medic look at that side." Why would an American soldier care about a German prisoner's comfort? Fritz asked, his tone not confrontational but genuinely curious. The question hung in the air. Paul had no answer that fit within his carefully constructed worldview. He turned and continued his rounds without another word. The next morning, he found Lieutenant Keller in the mail room again, her brow furrowed over a letter. "Problem?" he asked. She hesitated. "This letter is for the new prisoner, Fritz Werner. It's from his mother." Her voice wavered slightly. "She writes that their home in Dresden was destroyed in the bombing. His father didn't make it out." Paul felt a twist in his gut. "That's unfortunate." "Unfortunate?" Grace looked up sharply. "The man lost his father, and that's all you can say." "What do you want me to say?" "That's war." "No, that's a human tragedy." "There's a difference." She sealed the letter. "I'm delivering this one myself." Paul grabbed her arm. "That's against regulations." "Then report me," she challenged. "But someone should be there when he reads this." Paul released her arm slowly. "Fine. But I'm coming with you." They found Fritz in the camp library, organizing books. When Grace handed him the letter, the German's face lit up momentarily, then fell as he recognized his mother's handwriting. Paul watched from a distance as Fritz read, his expression crumbling. The prisoner's shoulders began to shake, silent tears streaming down his face. Grace placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. What happened next changed something in Paul forever. Fritz Werner, enemy soldier, Nazi by default, wept like any man would upon learning his father was dead. Before Paul could process this, he noticed other prisoners gathering, offering quiet words in German. One older prisoner put an arm around Fritz's shoulders. They were comforting him, as brothers might, as friends would. As humans do. That night, Paul couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Fritz Werner's face, saw the humanity he'd been denying for so long. What if these men were just like him, following orders, missing home, mourning their losses? What if the enemy wasn't as faceless as he needed them to be? The next morning, Paul was assigned to supervise a work detail in the camp's vegetable garden. Fritz was among the prisoners. As they worked side by side in the Texas heat, Paul found himself asking, "Did you get any sleep?" Fritz looked surprised at the question. "Not much." "Thank you for asking." An uncomfortable silence followed before Fritz added, "Your lieutenant, she was very kind yesterday." "She's not my lieutenant," Paul said automatically. "No?" Fritz raised an eyebrow. "The way you look at her suggests otherwise." Paul felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the sun. "That's not appropriate conversation, prisoner." Fritz returned to his work, a knowing smile on his face. Over the following weeks, Paul found himself assigned frequently to the mail room with Grace. Their conversations gradually extended beyond work. He learned she had grown up in Austin, that she had joined the WACs against her mother's wishes, that her favorite color was green and she played the piano. "Why are you here?" he asked her one rainy afternoon as they sorted through the weekly mail delivery. "You could be serving somewhere more important." Grace considered the question. Maybe understanding our enemy is important. These letters, she gestured to the pile between them, they are not battle plans or propaganda. They're mothers worrying about sons, wives telling husbands about gardens and children's first steps. They remind me what we're fighting for. What's that? The day when ordinary people can go back to ordinary lives. She met his eyes. When both sides can be just people again, not enemies. Her words stayed with him, challenging everything he'd believed since his brother's death. That evening, when a package arrived for Fritz containing a small, handmade baby blanket knitted by his wife, Paul found himself delivering it personally. Fritz's face transformed when he saw what it contained. "She finished it," he whispered, fingers tracing the delicate stitches. "For our child." "When is your baby due?" Paul heard himself ask. "Any day now." Fritz looked up, his eyes shining with pride and worry. "A child I've never seen, born into a world at war." Paul thought of his brother's pregnant wife back home. "I have a niece or nephew coming too. My brother never knew. He died before the letter reached him." Fritz nodded slowly. "Then we share the same grief, from opposite sides." He carefully folded the blanket. "Thank you, Private Tennyson, for bringing this yourself." As summer turned to fall, Paul found himself increasingly torn between his duty as a guard and his growing understanding of the prisoners as men. He began to notice Grace watching him with a warmth that made his heart race. Their hands would brush as they passed documents, lingering longer each time. Once, during a thunderstorm that knocked out the camp's electricity, they'd worked by lantern light, and he'd seen her face illuminated in the golden glow, beautiful and earnest. "What will you do after the war?" she asked him that night. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "Everything I thought I knew has changed." In October, a letter arrived for Fritz that caused a commotion in the mail room. His wife had given birth to a healthy baby girl. The camp commander, in a rare show of humanity, allowed a small celebration. That evening, Paul watched as the prisoners shared their meager rations of coffee and chocolate, toasting the new father. Grace appeared beside him, her uniform crisp in the autumn air. "It's nice to see some joy here for once." "It is," Paul agreed, surprising himself. 6 months ago, he would have seen this gathering as potential trouble, not a moment of shared humanity. As they walked back toward the administrative building, Grace stopped suddenly. "I received transfer orders today. Intelligence needs German translators in Washington." Paul felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "When do you leave?" "Next week." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the twilight. "I've been thinking about declining." "Why would you do that?" he asked, though his heart already knew the answer. "Because I've found something here I didn't expect to find." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Paul took a step closer. "Lieutenant Keller, Grace, we can't what? Recognize that this war has taught us both the same lesson? That humanity exists on both sides of a conflict." She reached for his hand. "That some connections are worth fighting for, even when they're complicated." In that moment, with her fingers intertwined with his, Paul felt the last of his defenses crumble. He had spent so long defining himself by who he hated that he'd forgotten how to love. But Grace had shown him another way forward. Their first kiss was brief, hidden in the shadow of the supply building, but it sealed something between them that Paul knew couldn't be undone. The following weeks brought increasing tension. Their relationship, though carefully concealed, felt increasingly dangerous as Paul's duties shifted. Intelligence had become suspicious that information might be leaking from the camp, and security protocols tightened. Guards were rotated to prevent fraternization with prisoners, and male privileges were temporarily suspended. Fritz approached Paul during exercise hours, his face lined with worry. "I haven't received a letter in 3 weeks. Is something wrong?" "New security measures," Paul explained quietly. "Nothing personal. My wife was ill after the birth. Please, if there's any news, I'll see what I can do," Paul promised, knowing he was crossing a line. That night, he slipped into the mail room after hours, searching through the backlog of undelivered letters. He found 3 addressed to Fritz, including one marked with a black border, the universal signal of death notice. His stomach dropped as he carefully opened it. The letter, written by Fritz's mother-in-law, confirmed his fears. His wife had developed a fever after childbirth and had passed away 3 days later. The baby was healthy and being cared for by family. Paul sat heavily in the chair, the letter trembling in his hands. How could he deliver this news? How could he not? As he struggled with his decision, the door opened. Grace stood there, her face pale in the dim light. "Paul, what are you doing?" "If they catch you, Fritz's wife is dead," he said simply, holding up the letter. He has a daughter he's never seen, and now he never will see his wife again either. Grace closed the door quietly behind her. "I'm so sorry. This war." Paul's voice broke. "It takes and takes and takes. From all sides." She crossed to him, taking the letter gently from his hands. "We'll tell him together." Fritz took the news with a quiet dignity that humbled Paul. The German sat motionless on his bunk, the letter clutched in his hands, as Grace translated the parts he couldn't understand through his grief. "She named her Elizabeth," he finally said. "After my mother." As they left the barracks, Paul noticed Captain Miller watching them from the guard tower, his expression suspicious. The next morning, Paul was summoned to the commander's office. Captain Miller stood beside the desk, arms crossed. "Private Tennyson, you've been observed engaging in inappropriate conduct with prisoners and possibly compromising camp security. Lieutenant Keller has already been questioned." Paul stood at attention, his mind racing. "Sir, you were seen entering the mail room after hours and subsequently visiting prisoner Werner with Lieutenant Keller. Unauthorized mail delivery is a serious breach of protocol. The prisoner's wife died, sir. It seemed inhumane to withhold that information." "Inhumane?" Miller's voice hardened. "Need I remind you these men are the enemy? With respect, sir, they're prisoners of war entitled to certain dignities under the Geneva Convention." The commander studied him for a long moment. "You're being reassigned, Private. Effective immediately. Report to Fort Sam Houston tomorrow morning." "And Lieutenant Keller?" "That's not your concern anymore." Paul spent that night packing his meager belongings, his heart heavy. He had no way to say goodbye to Grace, no way to explain to Fritz. Everything that had given his life meaning these past months was being stripped away. As he left his quarters before dawn, a figure stepped from the shadows. Grace stood there, her face resolute in the dim light. "I declined my transfer," she said without preamble, "and requested assignment to Fort Sam Houston instead." "Grace," he began, hardly daring to hope. "I won't let this war take one more thing from either of us," she declared. "Not when I finally found someone who understands what really matters." "They'll separate us anyway," Paul warned. "Military relationships between officers and enlisted, the war won't last forever," she replied. "And some things are worth waiting for." They parted with a promise to write, to find each other when circumstances allowed. As Paul boarded the transport truck, he caught a glimpse of Fritz in the exercise yard, the German raising his hand in a silent farewell. Something had changed irreversibly in Paul. The enemy had a face now, a name, a story. The war was no longer simple. Winter came, then spring. Paul's new assignment kept him busy training recruits, but Grace's letters sustained him. They wrote of the future, of hopes for peace, of the world they wanted to help build after the fighting stopped. In May 1945, news came of Germany's surrender. The camps began preparing for the eventual repatriation of prisoners. Paul, now promoted to corporal, requested a brief leave to visit Camp Hearne one last time. He found Fritz among the prisoners preparing to return to a devastated homeland. The German looked thinner, older, but there was peace in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I'm being sent home next month," Fritz told him. "To whatever is left. Your daughter is with my mother. I have a photograph now." Fritz pulled a worn image from his pocket, a solemn-eyed infant with his features. "She is why I must rebuild, why I must believe in something better." Paul nodded. "I understand that now." "And your lieutenant?" Fritz asked with a knowing smile. "Still writing. Still hoping." "Good." Fritz extended his hand. "In another time, we might have been friends, Corporal Tennyson." "In this time, we are," Paul replied, taking the offered hand. Later that day, as the Texas sunset painted the camp in gold and shadow, Paul waited by the main gate. Grace appeared, more beautiful than his memory had preserved, her uniform exchanged for a simple blue dress. "My discharge came through yesterday," she explained. "The army doesn't need German translators anymore." Paul took her hands in his. "And what do you need, Grace Keller?" "A future," she answered simply. "One where we remember what this war taught us, that humanity exists in unexpected places, and love is possible even when the world is breaking apart." 6 months later, a letter arrived at their small home in San Antonio. The postmark was German, the handwriting familiar. Inside was a photograph of Fritz holding a toddler with his eyes, standing before a partially rebuilt house. "We are making our way," he had written. "Elizabeth asks about America, and I tell her that someday, when the wounds have healed, we will visit. I tell her about the kind American soldier and the brave lieutenant who reminded me, in my darkest hour, that we are all simply people beneath our uniforms." Paul placed the letter on the mantel beside their wedding photograph. Outside, the winter sun shone on a world slowly healing from war. Grace came to stand beside him, her arm slipping around his waist. "He made it home," she said softly. "We all did," Paul replied, "in our own way." In the quiet of their living room, far from the battlefields and prison camps, they stood together, proof that even in war's long shadow, light could still find its way through.